This video is going to be about arranging for horns in three parts. Quite a few of you have asked me to cover the subject, so here it is. And I've enlisted the help of another arranger friend, Toshi Clinch, to help me out with this. Toshi's from Australia, so trying to understand our accents may be challenging for some of you. Toshi has a website with great resources on it, including a page about harmonizing jazz horns, which is why I asked him to join me in this video. And he is the tutor of a 10-week arranging course, which is absolutely awesome. I'll put links in the description. It's great to have you, Toshi.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think it's quite the privilege to be here. I've been checking out a bunch of your videos and I mean, always inspirational. And you definitely know a lot more about a lot of things in arranging that I have no clue about, like Gil Evans. I'm generally been in
Oh,
the Count Basie book, like way too many people, I guess.
oh, you're too kind, but yeah, thank you. And Count Basie's great.
I think we also, for the listeners that maybe can't understand our accents, we probably need to have some sort of, I don't know, subtitles underneath with all the slang going on at the same time.
True. Yeah, and of course, there's a difference between New Zealand and Australian slang. So yeah, do put your subtitles on, people, if you need them.
Cool. Well, why
Yeah,
don't we jump in and talk about some horn voicings?
let's do it.
A lot of people that teach arranging, especially how I learn arranging, generally is taught from maybe a piano primary sort of place where they'll build a voicing built around a certain hand shape. Or if it's not like that, they'll generally justify their choices by specific chord tones. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it takes away maybe the most important factor of voicings, which are the instruments themselves, right? It's so easy when we write music just to think about the notes and not think about the instruments, right? I'm sure you probably have stories of this where you've written something and you're like, yeah, this is great. And then you bring it in, you're like, wow, that sounds terrible.
True. Yeah, it's a good point. All right.
So when we look at voicings, and this, what I'm about to say is applicable to any sort of voicing, but obviously the topic of today is three horn voicings. So know that any of the skills we're talking about can be applied outside of just this scope, but we're going to specifically be looking at maybe the most common application, which is three horn voicings. And so what I like to do is break down voicings or writing three horn voicings into four main sort of categories that I like to call pillars. Just kind of they build up the foundation of what a voicing is. So the first one is stability, right? How does the chord voicing sound together? Now, what I mean by that is how do the horns themselves feel like as a section when they play the voicing, right? Does it feel stable or unstable? The second is the actual chord tones and how well the voicing reinforces the chord symbol that it's accompanying, right? So if it says C7, what chord tones are in the voicing? Now, the third part is register. So when we deal with instruments, every instrument has, upper, middle, lower register, and that impacts certain ways that, the timbre of the instrument as well as projection. So we need to be mindful of when we slot a note from a voicing on any instrument, how that or the implications that has on, I guess, the overall sound and balance. And also the texture, I guess, too. A lot of people are aware of texture from, say, like you put a mute in the trumpet or whatnot. But if you put it in the upper register, that's going to feel differently than if it's in the lower register. And then finally, a lot of times when we think about voicings, we think vertically only. Oh, it's this shape, and we look at everything in a vacuum. But realistically, when you're writing out voicings, it doesn't just happen once most of the time. It happens in a kind of a continuum of the music, right? Very rarely it's just a one-off voicing. And so what I like to think about this fourth and final pillar is the horizontal motion and maybe thinking about, the inner lines and more acting contrapuntally, maybe kind of like how Bach once looked at it hundreds of years ago. I generally like to think about it in these four pillars. I don't know, Alex, have you ever thought about voicings in these sort of ways or different ways?
Good questions. Yeah, I've thought about voices in a lot of ways, too many ways.
Sure.
I reckon, because sometimes I lie in bed at night thinking about them, which is you know.
I think that's a problem only you and me can relate to in the whole world, and maybe two other people.
Maybe. But what, and this isn't just meant to be a big plug for your courses, but your resources on your website are really good. And, this is what
Oh,
I
thank you.
liked when I saw what I saw from your page, is that you had it really nicely laid out. And I think, it can be good to have a structure of a way to learn something.
So we're going to start off with stability. And this is kind of like my curveball because most people don't start in this sort of manner. They generally start with chord tones because it kind of just makes sense, right? Oh, what's in the C7? C, let's voice the C. But because that is so normal, I want to take a second and break from that. And to do that, what I want you to think about is when we hear a horn voicing on a stage, let's say you got a band going, three horns and rhythm section, or a vocalist. When you hear the horns play, are you thinking, oh, yeah, that person's playing the third in relationship to the chord symbol played by the piano? I mean, what do you think, Alex? Do you hear it like that?
Nah, I don't.
No, I don't. I just hear it as like, oh, that horn section feels good or bad, right?
Yep.
Later on we go in and analyze it and whatnot. But that that was the realization I had, coming out of all the lockdowns, is that I was thinking about voicing the ninth and the sharp 11th or whatever chord tone more so than how do these three instruments work together and does that sound good by itself? And I guess gave me the reality that sometimes if we lead by chord tones, we actually create pretty unstable sounding voicings, right? So a great example of this, let's just say two parts for a second, right? If you're voicing C7, what are the two most important notes that most people get taught to voice? The third and the seventh, right? Now in a dominant seven chord, what's the interval between the third and the seventh? It's a tritone. Now, is the tritone a stable interval? No, it's dissonant, right? And so if you
Mm,
create a horn voicing with just those two notes, you're going to be like, yeah, this is great voicing. It represents the chord symbol. But actually, you've just created a whole lot of dissonance, right? And
yeah.
unless you hear that in person, a lot of the time your mind just justifies it from a chord symbol standpoint. So when we look at three horn voicings, what we want to be thinking about, at least one of these approaches, is thinking about stability. How do these notes work with each other, and does that feel stable or unstable? Does it support each other or not? Or are we adding more dissonance into the equation or less dissonance? Great example, like I just said, that tritone is a way of, when you hear a C7 chord, you don't think that's a really dissonant chord. But when you highlight the tritone, you're highlighting the instability in that chord. So the idea with these voicings, when you lean on stability, you can have a stable voicing that feels colorful, but you can also have an unstable voicing that is not colorful, such as the tritone in a C7, right? So bringing this into maybe a three horn context, what one of the most stable structures that if you've grown up in a Western society, you're going to know this. It's the triad, right? Major triad, minor triad, whatever, right? Generally pretty comfortable. And some
Mm,
would argue that it's probably easier to tune and whatnot a triad than say a unison or an octave note, right? And so
yeah.
when we look at voicings, if we're wanting to prioritize stability, a triadic voicing for three horns is going to be one of the great first options to lean into. And then we get to choose, do we lean into the color of a chord or do we lean into where the triad exists? So, really, I guess an example of this is if we had, say, a C7, sharp 5, sharp 9, right? Imagine in your head quickly, right?
Hmm.
Sharp 5, G sharp, or we think about A flat, and then the sharp 9, D sharp, or E flat. Well, you could create an A flat triad right there, right between A flat, C, and E flat. And that's going to be really stable as a horn voicing because it's a triad. But it's also highlighting the sharp 5 and the sharp 9, which means it's going to be extremely colorful. Okay. And so that means you can have a stable voicing, which also feels extremely colorful. It doesn't just have to be 1, 3, 5, which a lot of people, when you say triad, that's where their mind goes immediately. Now, it depends on context, which way you go about this. In a jazz setting, you would probably lean into a more colorful option, highlighting extensions and alterations where possible. But in a pop or commercial setting, generally those colors may be a bit too much for the, that sort of sound. So you're probably going to be looking at, your 1, 3, 5, and then sometimes, your seventh, depending on what artist you're working with. So there's a few ways that we can use that, I guess. Is that making sense? Or am I just rattling off random things?
No, that's perfect. It makes total sense.
So we got this triadic idea, right? Pretty straightforward. Most people understand triads. It feels stable, right? It can be in inversions or anything like that. But the idea is that the three notes together, whatever capacity, whether it's open or closed sort of look, it's a three note that makes up a triad if you were to move the notes around eventually. So many people think of, I guess they discredit this really quickly because they think it's too simple. At least I did. If we look at the music or great three horn examples, what you find is an abundance of triadic voicings, more so than you might ever expect. Why don't we take a second and have a look, at least an example, which comes from a great Art Blakey example written by Wayne Shorter called "This Is for Albert." Once the melody kicks in, a couple bars into it, what you'll see is at the start a lot of octave general lines, but then coming in bar 5, we start seeing the horns enter harmony. And how Wayne Shorter has actually harmonized this, if you look closely, is just a whole lot of triadic structures. Now, if you listen to it, it doesn't feel bland or boring. It feels exciting. It feels comfortable, right? And the exciting part of it is all the different timbres of those instruments. We get to highlight the tenor sax, the trumpet, and then also the trombone in this case, right? But then if we look closer, we can actually see what notes he's actually choosing to highlight. And that gives us maybe a bit more of an understanding of if we wanted to capture the sound of three horns in Art Blakey context, what we could do. So if we look at this first bar, specifically the C minor 7, well, it's a pretty straightforward chord, right? We got a B flat, we got an E flat, and a G, which another way of thinking about that is just an E flat major triad in inversion, right? I'm just going to think about E flat major triad. Or a third, a fifth, a seventh of C minor 7. Nothing really outlandish there, but when you hear it, it feels great. He's leaning into so many other aspects of the music that make it interesting, more so than just color and voicings. But if we look throughout, there's passing tones and everything like that. So we get a lot of that color involved, even if the triads maybe are landing more on the fundamental harmony. When you listen to Art Blakey, Alex, or any of those great jazz small group blue note settings, do you have any idea, or when you hear it, are you thinking about what sort of voicing might be happening?
Only if I'm like listening to the music in that way and because I'm an arranger and that stuff interests me. But generally, no, you feel the fun of the music and this track especially, right? Which is awesome. I've this how old I am. I've got the CD of this. And this bit's really nice. It's rhythmic and it comes after these unisons and then it sounds really fat with the horns. So
Yeah.
no.
Uh, but like in this example, when I hear it, it's like, well, I don't necessarily think that it sounds boring or bland because it's a triad. I just think, yeah, that works, right?
Totally.
And I think it just backs up that same idea of just because triads are a simple shape that most people get introduced to in, grade 1 music class, doesn't mean like if it's good enough for Wayne Shorter, it's good enough for us, right?
Totally. I did a video about Wayne Shorter's Infant Eyes and
Oh, okay.
yeah, so I'm big Wayne fan and hopefully a few other people watching are as well. And for the Gil Evans angle, he definitely uses plenty of triads. So
Right.
there's no shame in the triad.
But like when we talk about triads, they get the job done. They're very versatile. Like I guess if we look at this example, a lot of them are major triads, but there's also, very much you could lean on minor triads and diminished and augmented, although they're maybe dissonant in the context of a chord symbol. they're also still very stable because they're built up of thirds, right? Whether it be minor or major thirds. So you can still get a lot of color from those sort of stable structures, right?
Totally. I really like, if I look at that B flat major seven, so there's the D minor triad there, and further on we've got the like a E flat minor triad and the D7 flat nine sharp five. I mean
Right.
that's just awesome. You got the
Yeah.
colors plus the stability.
Right. I mean, there's two voicings that I think really stand out here, which is over that A flat major seven chord, right? You got the E
Mm.
flat major, which, right, that's the fifth, the major seven, and the ninth. So
Yep.
highlighting that ninth sound. And I guess this may be a good time just to, a little caveat to mention. Often with three horn voicings, we generally want, like a lot of people think we must make it tick off the sounds of the chord symbol, right? So if we saw A flat major seven, they'd be like, oh, we really need the third and seventh in there. But realistically, with three horns, very rarely can you have a stable voicing which ticks off all of the color, like all of the fundamental notes, as well as brings in color, just because you're only dealing with three horns, right? Or three notes. Like you can
Totally.
really only start thinking that way once you add a fourth instrument. And so what Wayne Short is showing us here is, well, you can still get a lot of color and it doesn't necessarily matter as much. Because when you listen to that in the recording, it doesn't say, it doesn't feel like that's a bad voicing. You know, we just
No.
hear that color, I guess, against the bass note.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you were saying, the D7 flat nine sharp five, right? The E flat minor triad there. It's wonderful, right? We're picking up the major third, but instead of having that seventh, you get the sharp five or flat 13 and the flat nine. And it feels
Mm.
great,
Yeah.
you
It's
know?
nice.
So it's almost like in this small 4 bars masterclass in how to use triads in 3 or 4 different ways. Well, I want to bring attention to this chord in right at the end of this fourth bar here. The D7 flat nine here, because this kind of breaks the mold now, and it's a great way to enter the next example, right? And so if you look at this is maybe more a conventional approach for voicing how, if you're coming straight out of university or school, you might be thinking more along these lines, right? It has the third on the bottom, the F sharp, it has the C, right, the seventh, and then it has the E flat, the flat nine. So it ticks,
Yeah.
the idea of representing the chord symbol more accurately, where it has the third and seventh, the fundamental notes that give you the sound of that, foundational chord, but then also has a color tone in there. But the problem with
Nice.
this is it's a very unstable chord because if you think about the intervallic relationships between them, they're not as common as a triad, right? If you were to get three people to play this perfectly in tune, it'd be much more difficult than, a major triad. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. But what I want to do is introduce this idea of compromise because so often in arranging and writing, we feel like we have to tick all the boxes and make it perfect. But so rarely can we do that, right? So with these pillars, what I want you to think about is these are just different areas you can lean into. And you, as the writer, get to choose which way you want to lean into. And unlikely, you will actually be able to lean into all 4 of them at once. So let's talk about chord tones.
Mm.
So this second pillar, right, it's just about creating a voicing which best represents the chord symbol. And I like to call them jazz voicings, but maybe more commonly they're called shell voicings on the piano, right? Where you generally have the fundamental notes and then some sort of color tone or extra tone in there, just depending on exactly how it lays. And these are great because they give maybe a better representation of the chord symbol and they give a lot of color. There's a lot of bang for the buck, but they feel unstable. So they're maybe not good over a lot of time unless you're looking for that instability in the horn section. So, what I mean by this is if you look at how Wayne Short has used this one voicing in this 4 bars, it's only one voicing out of the entire 4 bars. Everything else is triadic. And so it just gives that bit more emphasis on this final voicing. But if we move ahead a little bit to the B section, we see an even better example of this, right? Of this G major 7 sharp 11 over D flat. Quite the creative chord, and maybe not one I personally would have got to, but I'm not Wayne Shorter, and he's able to pull these magical chord symbols from somewhere. But if we look at this voicing, we have just an immense amount of color, but also maybe not the most structurally stable voicing, right? You have the F sharp on the top, followed by a D underneath, and then a G on the bottom, right? So kind of loosely some sort of G major sound. But again, you got the major 7 between the first and the third voice, not maybe super stable, but a whole lot of color, right? And again, you're hearing it against this D flat sound. So you get a huge amount of color, maybe not the most stable, but you're not caring about the stability because having an unstable chord just makes it feel more colorful in this instance. Interestingly enough, if you backtrack just a bar on beat two of that A flat minor 7 over D flat, you actually see another variation of one of these jazz voicings, right? Where you have, the C flat being the third, then you have the A flat and then the G flat, right? So you have the third and the seventh in there plus the fifth. It's again, it's maybe not as stable because it's a closer voicing, right? We have that G flat right up against the A flat instead of having maybe a third distance. But when you look at all these voicings, they're not every single voicing. They're used maybe more for specific target points or for voice leading purposes. So I like to think of them as I reserve them for special moments because they can feel a bit more chaotic from the horn stability side, but can at the expense of feeling, extremely colorful and dynamic and great for those explosive hits or moments where you want a lot of impact. Have you had any history writing these sort of voicings before, Alex?
Yeah, sure. Plenty of them actually. And you're right, the chord tone thing, it does get taught a lot. I like how you talk about that stability first because, in that A flat minor 7, that second beat, that's a good example of covering chord tones, but it's not quite as stable just because of the intervals present and, there being the perfect fourth and the outer voices. But I
Sure.
also love how Wayne has that G major 7 sharp 11 and we get the major 7
Right.
spread there, and it's not an accident, it's on the highest note of the whole phrase, right? In the
And the
climactic point.
longest. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So so to answer your question, yes, and Wayne still did very nicely here.
Oh, I agree. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, the secret here is that we get to choose the examples in advance. So of course they got to back up what we're talking about.
That's
But
right.
I think, like at least from my personal experience, this is how I would voice everything once upon a time. Like when I was just getting used to arranging, I would voice every note like that. And if I go back and listen to some of those, handheld recordings from rehearsals, it's just really dissonant. And there's not a problem with having a lot of dissonance, but it can be very heavy. And if you're listening to that amount of dissonance the entire time, I guess one way I would put it is I was taught by my teacher, Rich DeRosa, this concept of too many cheeseburgers. But it's a story about saturation points. So you can think of a voicing type like this as a cheeseburger. When you eat a cheeseburger and you take a bite, you're like, yeah, I want another bite. That tastes good. But there's going to come a point, you're 5 cheeseburgers deep. You hate the taste of a cheeseburger, right? And you don't want another bite of that at all. And you need to change to something else if you're still hungry, right? You need a drink of something, maybe it's chips, maybe it's, fruit or anything else. You want something to kind of cleanse the palate. And what ends up happening when I listen to those older recordings of mine is that I realized I've eaten too many cheeseburgers. I've used too many of these voicings and it's highly dissonant all of the time. It feels, you hear that instability come out.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and it just shows how different, the three horn voicing sort of approaches really to a lot of the stuff I teach on the channel, where I'm looking at four or five
Right.
Sometimes 6 note voicings where you can cover the whole chord all the time, right? So
Right.
you don't
Right.
have to worry so much about that. But the three horns is sort of special in that way, or and
Yeah.
obviously two horns as well. So
I actually
yeah, no,
find
I
three
like it.
horns maybe the most difficult to write
It's
because
tricky.
you have just enough voices where you can cover the fundamental tones,
Yeah,
but also when you do it like in one of these sort of shell voicings, it comes at the cost of that stability. So it's you have to measure up. Do I want it to feel as crunchy or not? You know,
yeah,
whereas you have four horns, you can kind of get the crunchiness just from the chord tones more so than how they relate to one another.
totally. For
Okay, so why don't we jump into the big R word to let you know what it is? It's register. It's nothing bad. It's
good.
it's only the only one thing that people generally forget about, right? When they start voicing. And again, something from my end, something that I didn't think about for ages, but when I learnt about it, literally lesson one in my jazz arranging class. When it comes down to register, there's two important factors that we need to be mindful of. That register impacts the overall sound of a voicing because of the timbre that's associated with that register, but also that register impacts projection. And what I mean by that is instruments in their higher register will project more than instruments in their lower register, right? So going back to this Wayne Shorter example, if we look at this G major 7 chord, what's really interesting is how Wayne has decided to voice these notes to the instruments. So the top line is trumpet, but then the second line is actually tenor sax. And that is incredibly high for a tenor sax. And so high, in fact, that we can say that it is much higher in comparison to where the trumpet lands in its register. And because of that, we hear the tenor sax really prominently in this voicing. You hear that D way more than the F sharp. We also should address the G here, and that's for the trombone. Okay, and that is about in the same place comparable to the trumpet. So they're pretty even, but this tenor saxophone is up there. So when we think about these three notes, we need to think about how we assign them in terms of register. And what's really interesting is most three horn groups, right, or sections are three different instruments, which means that you have three unique registers, unlike, say, a trumpet section in a big band, which all has the same registers, right, because they're all the same instrument. And that means we need to be extra careful with where we put these notes. So if we applied a triadic voicing because of stability and we put it up there, those instruments like the tenor or even like a bari sax or something that are much lower than the trumpet are going to sit very high, right? Such as the example with the tenor saxophone in this voicing. And so we
Mm.
then need to start looking at spreading that voicing around with more octave displacements. So just for interest's sake, let's have a look at a version of this, which is having the D now down an octave, right? Which may be more how I might approach it, just because I'm maybe a bit safer than putting my tenor saxophone that high. But I love it. I love hearing that. I probably should do that more often because it sounds
Mhm.
so great. But if we look at this now with the D on the bottom, right? The tenor saxophone still being on the second voice right now on that G is comparable to where the trumpet is. And now the trombone is on the D, which is kind of more in its middle register. And so it now reorganizes so that the trumpet is the true lead once again, right? We hear the top note as being the lead note in this instance. And it gives such a drastically different result comparing from the original to that. Neither is right or wrong. They're just both different. And you can hear the difference both from the timbre of upper register tenor. But if you were in person, you'd hear the difference in projection where the tenor saxophone is not now naturally leading the section. But it's an interesting thing that so many people don't think about just because we're so used to saying, oh, we're sitting on the piano or whatnot, and we plug our 3 note voicing and then we chuck it on the horns. All easy said and done. But unfortunately, in these sort of settings with mixed horns, it can lead to some pretty big pitfalls that, if that trumpet got any higher, very quickly that's off the tenor saxophone's range. And, or it's in altissimo, and that's going to sound drastically different. Have you ever come across
Yeah.
something like this before?
Oh, for sure. I think it's a great point too. I mean, of course, Wayne uses it well here. Like we said, it's a long note. It's the climax of the phrase, which is partly why it works, right?
Sure.
Um, but yeah, this is just exactly something you got to be careful about, and you sort of have to have the registers of instruments sort of really inbuilt, and not only know
Right.
the edges of their range, but know where they sound fat. Because if
Yeah.
you want something to sound fat, you can make sure they're all in a really solid, nice range, and then you'll get a really big, beefy voicing.
Right.
Mm.
A little tip I have that was suggested to me once is if you compose at the piano, just get a couple pieces of tape and put down like the entire range of the instruments you're writing for. So in this case, if it was these three horns, and that way you can see when you look at the piano, the entire range of those instruments, and you're not going to write out of it, and you're going to know, oh, this is right at the top or this is right at the bottom. It gives you a better
Yeah.
indication of, you know, what it's going to sound like.
There's no shame in having like a range chart. And and
100%.
and actually a lot of these horns, a lot of their range overlaps too, especially with the
Correct, right?
alto sax in there too. So, it's not something to be, don't get too worried about it, but definitely
No.
please consider register.
Well, with that in mind, why don't we wrap this thing up and land on our fourth pillar, right? Which
Great.
is horizontal motion. Now, that's a very
Mm,
fancy way of saying thinking about the notes as melodies, right? So often when we think about voicings, myself included, we think vertically, right? How the notes stack up on top of each other. But so rarely do those notes actually land stacked up on top of each other in the context of, a song. If we looked at that, this is for Albert example, they're all moving, for 4 bars or however long, you have multiple voicings back to back to back to back, which means that all of the lines, not just the melody, have new melodies assigned to them through these inner voices. So, one way to think about this is instead of creating a voicing structured specifically about chord tones or stability or register, you purely pick the notes based on creating a nice melody that resolves into it. A great example of this, when we just think of historic arrangers, is comparing, say, the works of Duke Ellington with Thad Jones, right? So Thad Jones, very much someone that writes very vertically, loves those big, juicy 8 note, 13
mm,
sharp 11 altered 9 voicings.
yeah.
But then what happens if you're a tenor sax, tenor 2 in the big band or a third trombone or whatnot? You get pretty shafted.
Yeah.
But that's the compromise that Thad made. Whereas someone like Ellington, or even if we look at earlier jazz, when they had fewer people in a band, often what happens is the priority is on landing on great notes for the individuals. And interestingly, when we're dealing with three horns, you only have three instruments that you're really thinking about here, which means that they're really easy to hear as their own instrument. You don't hear them as a section all the time. And if you hear, any of the great Blue Note, Art Blakey records, you end up hearing each of the components very easily. They actually pan them like far left, center, far right. So it's super easy to transcribe and hear the notes. And so it becomes really obvious if they get dealt a pretty terrible line, right? And
Yeah.
so as we look at three horns or smaller horn voicings like two, there's maybe more of a priority on horizontal motion more than ticking off any of the other pillars that we've looked at. And so an example of this is actually we jump over to a Art Blakey alum, Lee Morgan, with his own band, right? So
Mm,
in this tune, The Murphy Man, what we see is kind of the shifting of voicings based on inner resolutions, between chord symbols and whatnot, which are moving horizontally. So if you have a look at here, right, in the second bar, and specifically looking at the second voice here, which is the tenor sax again, we see the F resolved to the E flat, while the trumpet on top is just repeating the G's. And so, yeah, we could be thinking about this moving horizontally, but realistically, G7 is the sound for, this bar. And so this motion is more hearing that relationship of the second voice against the first voice more than thinking about any chord tones. It just happens that you're able to tick off some of the chord tone boxes while it goes. And this happens again in the fourth bar with both the bottom voices, right? Where you see the second voice moving up chromatically, and that's also equaled by the third voice too. And so while they do tick off these chord tone justifications and whatnot, then when you listen to it, you're not hearing it more so from a chord tone point. You're hearing more of this horizontal motion. And unfortunately, I find this is probably the most difficult to write as because it comes down to writing melodically and what you think makes a good melody. For me, plunking out voicings, pretty straightforward once you kind of understand the different techniques available to you. But making a melody that sounds great, I think, is the easiest place to get writer's block, or at least I find that. And so
Totally.
sometimes these really unique horizontal things, we get, you know, various structures that you might not get otherwise. Like, for instance, if we look at the second bar with G7 here, right, you have that second, the second voice right up against the melody note, right? That F and the G right next to each other. And then it eventually
Mm.
resolves away. But very rarely are you placing in a three horn setting, the two voices right up next to each other, right?
Yeah.
Unless you
Yeah.
really want the clash. But it's so that you get that lovely move. And the same thing if you look at the next voicing, right? It's a stack of fourths, a chordal voicing, but they're resolving it back into something that's triadic. So I almost would imagine they knew where they were going and then came back from that to then get that chordal voicing more so than thinking about stacked fourths to begin with.
It's something I talk about on this channel quite a bit with how I harmonize like Gill videos where we
Right.
talk about voice leading and I like to think of it as a target chord. You know, you said hitting
Yeah,
that
right.
F13, that was sort of the goal, and that gives us a direction to get there. It's one way I think of figuring it out. But you're right,
Totally.
melodies are harder than voicings in a
Right.
sense. So yeah,
And
but I love this point.
what's interesting about it is because you have so few horns, you can make more melodies out of it. Whereas if you have like 15 horns, like a huge big band, it's very hard to have like 15 melodies, and it's probably not going to happen. And
Yeah,
you're not going to hear 15 melodies. At a certain point, just you hear
yeah.
harmony. But yeah, so you get a lot, this can yield a lot of interesting results, but also maybe is out of all the four pillars, the one that maybe is the most important. Because
Mm,
realistically, when people play, they're just playing melodies. Harmony is kind of like this concept which occurs when melodies are stacked on top of one another. And a
for sure.
homophonic texture can still be three melodies stacked on top of each other. Like you said in Gil Evans' music, this happens so often, you know?
Yeah.
Uh, I find, like, is there a favorite moment that you might have, with contrapuntal motion like this?
Yeah, I mean, I knew we were going to get back to counterpoint. You said
Sure.
it at the start, but and especially thinking about different melodies combining, I think that's an important point, and that's how harmony started, really. Um, a
Right.
scholar might be able to take me down on that, but I actually think about the way he writes like a baritone or tuba line often
Mm,
as a type of counterpoint,
mm,
and so I'll pick out the A section of My Ship. Let's
mhm.
say there's a beautiful bass line as well as inner movement.
Right.
So yeah, check out My Ship, the A
Yeah.
section, which is completely harmonized. Yeah, and I think it's something you can add later. I mean, that sounds really silly,
Right.
like, oh, add some chocolate icing, but it's something once you've got some good basics in, you can start to spruce up some of the ideas.
I agree. Like, when you're doing writing voicings or arranging anything, it's not like we're improvising this. It's not happening in the moment. We can go back and edit whatever we want. I think that's a great way of summing up this whole idea is that this whole concept of four pillars and all these voicing techniques that we've discussed, they're just approaches. None of them are right or wrong. Some are going to be more suitable for certain situations, or maybe better for certain contexts or eras that you might be writing in. But they're all just different options. You know, rules and music theory came after people wrote like this.
That's
But
right.
I think it's just a nice way of thinking, these are just options and you get to pick what option you think sounds good. And that in itself makes your music interesting and makes it different and unique to everyone else. So hopefully this has helped, I guess, give a couple of options. And I guess one other thing is, and this is a secret, you don't need to use voicings for three horns. You can also write unison and octaves, and it's just as effective.
That's right. Simple music played well is
Yeah,
always great. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Oh, thanks, Toshi. This has been great. I love how you, like I said, how you approach these three horn voicings with your four pillars. I think it's really effective way of thinking about it.
Oh, thank
And,
you.
please check out Toshi's site. Like he's got really good, clear resources with examples.
It's a lot of
And
reading, so I apologize in advance if you fall asleep by the second paragraph.
but it's also good stuff. And so thanks so much for coming on, Toshi. And please check out his 10-week course. He's got a lot of people signing up, and it looks like they learn a bunch from you. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's been quite the pleasure, and I've always enjoyed nerding out on arranging.